President Trump has unveiled a nearly $200 million aid package to Ukraine. But is it full of outdated equipment, or is it exactly what Ukraine is looking for? Plus, we're going to talk about the Ukraine-Russia peace talks that collapsed in mere minutes, but did they still get some progress? And of course, Russia's plan to institute Gulag 2.0. Wouldn't want to be a Russian dissident or a Russian at all. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's get into it. Okay, so Trump has announced an EU arms agreement that includes aid for Ukraine. And this is something that he had discussed at some length. Simply, Trump, the businessman, never wants to give anything away. He doesn't believe in it. So he said, listen, aid to Ukraine, well, the European Union can purchase anything they want from the United States, and they can give it to Ukraine once it's theirs. This is actually something of an improvement from his previous stance, which is don't help Ukraine at all. However, the aid package itself it seems like more of a gradual start. In fact, this is actually 2 aid packages totaling about $300 million. For context, the previous administration funded Ukraine to the tune of around $20 billion a year, so 60 times this much. But nonetheless, what I would like to point out, and often do, is that those initial aid packages were with something called the Presidential Drawdown Authority. And what that was a right of the U.S. president to say, listen, gear that has already been purchased and has already been used for its purpose can be allocated to allied countries, right? When the military is drawing down. So for the United States, they said, listen, we have a ton of this gear that we were using in Afghanistan, or that was bought in preparation for the Afghan and Iraq wars, and now it's just sitting around. Why don't we give it to Ukraine? And while in some cases it was highly effective equipment, Bradleys or MRAPs, in a lot of cases it was equipment that didn't really have much of a role. But Ukraine kind of had to finagle their tactics to even make it relevant. Things like chemical weapons detection stuff, or certain types of like anti-rotary wing radar, right? Things that just stopped being relevant on the modern battlefield. But that is not the case. The nice thing about this program is that Ukraine raises its hand and says, this is exactly what we need. So there's none of this $322 million is going to go to excess equipment, to broken equipment, to old stuff that was only really useful in Iraq. All of this is going to be highly tailored to Ukraine's need. They include, critically, Hawk Phase 3 air defense systems, parts and repair stuff for Bradleys. And what's interesting is here is from the Defense Security Cooperation Agency, outlining exactly what it is. So Ukraine has asked for sustainment articles and services for the Hawk missile system. What's really interesting about the Hawk is that this is a Cold War relic. You can see here, but that's part of the appeal, because Shaheds, you have to understand, and these Russian drones, they behave like a Cold War aircraft, right? A single engine, jet or propeller, limited maneuverability, big radar cross section. It's something that the Hawk is perfectly tailored to take out. And the appeal is that the Hawk is cheap, right? It's small. It's a 115-pound warhead. Right? Semi-active radar homing, very, very simple, very cheap, very effective. And there's a reason that it was fielded in 1960 and continues to be used to today. And that's what Ukraine needs. They need the ability to take out these Shaheds on the cheap. So they've said, listen, help us get these Hawk missile systems kicking, 5-ton cargo trucks to move their missiles, spare parts, refurbishment, some system overhaul to give them the most modern firing control kits, toolkits, test equipment, support equipment, technical documentation, additional training for our crews, U.S. government and contractor technical and field office support, which is interesting because it's casually dropping that, yeah, there's going to be some U.S. Citizens, almost certainly not U.S. government employees, but independent contractors helping operate these things in Ukraine. U.S. government and contractor technical assistance, storage containers, equipment, spare parts, MIM-23 Hawk missile spare parts and missile repair gear, other related logistics and program support, right? So $172 million going straight to Ukraine's air defenses, badly needed, something that's going to be really, really help them out against these Russian Shaheds. And the appeal, and Trump is right when he says that it's not going to impact U.S. readiness, because we have phased out the Hawk, literally phased it out in the 90s. So this is a huge sign that, again, as I always point out, President Trump is, regardless of what you think of him, he says a lot of things and he does far fewer of the things that he says, right? So it's one thing to say, hey, I'm going to start supporting Ukraine. I'm going to think about sanctioning Russia. It's a different thing to actually greenlight weapons sales. That is exactly what Ukraine needs. Now, before we talk about the status of the Russia-Ukraine peace talks, or lack thereof, and Putin's pretty sus expansion of his FSB's powers to essentially open their own gulag, I wanted to mention, of course, that you guys know I have a 2-year-old, I have a 1-month-old, and just 2 weeks ago, I still ran a triathlon. Why? Because I'm a little crazy, but also because I am fueled by the best, right? Strike gum, right? I made it for guys like us, guys that don't I'm busy, I'm tired. They don't let that stuff stop them. They decide what they're going to do and they get it done. If that's you, you understand exactly why Strike Gum hits different, okay? With 90 milligrams of caffeine in every piece, 100 milligrams of alpha GPC, right? That's something that even Andrew Huberman has started to acknowledge is a tremendous focus and cognitive enhancer. It's got everything you need, and with no sugar, it's got nothing that you don't. So your diet's going to stay intact. You're going to get to lock in and get all the caffeine of an energy drink. There's a reason why 80% of people that chew a single piece of Strike Gum reorder. I see it in the data. So if you want to become part of the 1% of guys, click the link in the description, pick up your Strike Gum today. Okay. Peace talks. To no one's shock, peace talks going nowhere. Now, it's unfair to say. This was a brief meeting between Russia and Ukraine in Istanbul, and they were nowhere close to each other on ceasefire terms or even getting the leaders to meet. Right? The talks lasted just 40 minutes, guys. That's like not even an episode of an HBO show. Okay. But they were able to agree on continued prisoner swaps, which is not nothing. And sometimes in peace talks, just having the venue, having a place where peace talks can happen is itself kind of a victory. But the fact is that Moscow is asking for basically the right to call timeout whenever they want, which is kind of ridiculous, right? Moscow called for a series of short ceasefires of 24 to 48 hours to enable the retrieval of bodies, i.e. whenever things are bad for Russia, they want to call timeout. Ukraine is like, no. If we're going to end the match, we got to end the match, right? You don't get to just take a break whenever you get tired. Imagine in a boxing match where one of the people said, listen, I just want the right to stop the round whenever I want. I just want to get a timeout. You'd go, no, dude, either the fight ends or the fight continues. So again, this, I think it's fair to say Moscow is just sort of saying these things to like appear serious when they're not. No sign of progress towards those goals. There is, though, some signs of progress of another key Ukrainian issue, namely Ukrainian children that Russia has taken and essentially adopted out into Russian families. These are Ukrainian children in the occupied regions that for one reason or another were separated from their parents. Either their parents were killed, their parents fled. These kids were taken and were basically had their identity stripped and were sent into Russia, right? So Ukraine has said, listen, we have identified 339 children that we think you've abducted. Russia denies the charge, saying it's offered protection to children, saying it's not true that we've taken these children. We just took them, right? We just offered protection to children separated from their parents during the war. So essentially saying, yeah, this is 100% what we did. Again, the thing to point out is that they sit there and say, well, how could we have protected these children? We were just keeping them safe, but there's a venue that has gone on for 3 years where Russia and Ukraine can peacefully exchange prisoners. So you see the conundrum here, right? At any time, Russia could have taken those kids and say, listen, we're going to turn them over to the Ukrainian government. That's what the U.S. does when it has unaccompanied children arrive at the border. They say, listen, you're a kid. It's terrible that you're here. We're going to keep you safe. But as soon as humanly possible, we're going to verify your identity. And we're going to contact your embassy. And we're going to get you home. So the fact that Russia conveniently didn't realize they could do that is probably a sign that were up to something more nefarious. Classic Russian nonsense, right? Ukrainian authorities say there's at least 19,000 children who have been forcibly deported, even though they are trying to get only the 339 that they have verified are in Russian custody. These are, of course, the shortest talks that have happened so far. But that's because Russia doesn't really plan on stopping. And it's fairly obvious when you look at their government decisions, because they are continuing to create a massive detention system, really trying to build out what is essentially a political gulag. Right? Russian President Vladimir Putin signed a decree, which is, of course, the same thing as a law, because when Vladimir Putin always gets what he wants, authorizing the FSB, this is the successor to the KGB, to create an autonomous pretrial detention facilities, which is just a pretty grisly name for saying, we aren't going to charge you or try you. We're just going to arrest you. And the KGB will have supervision over these detention facilities that will hold individuals accused of crimes under the FSB's jurisdiction. Yikes. Right? And the FSB also Putin has also expanded the FSB's powers into some pretty wild areas. For example, the FSB now has authority over ports, right? And this is troubling because it essentially says, listen, the KGB is going to regulate foreign economic relations and the isolation of port infrastructure from the outside world. This is just another instance in which the FSB is expanding and exercising much greater control over the Russian civilian economy. And we've talked about the fact that essentially Vladimir Putin has had to run this balancing act because he wants to isolate the Russian public, and especially Russian oligarchs and businessmen who wield considerable power in Russia. He needs to isolate them from the worst effects of the war, namely the economic ones. But at the same time, he has to make sure that the public and the oligarchs remain in line. So he has to find this delicate balance between not bothering them with the state of the war and making sure they remain controlled, right? So you have to keep them unbothered, but also keep them on a tight leash, right? The old iron fist and a velvet glove. Well, it seems like he's skewing more towards the side of the iron fist, as the FSB controlling ports means that almost every Russian oligarch's business relies on either imported raw materials or exporting things like oil or nickel. And so this means that the FSB is going to be able to collect tolls and enforce and punish oligarchs who are seen as non-cooperative with the state. It's essentially taking the power of the KGB, the FSB, using it as a gun and putting it to the head of those oligarchs. It doesn't matter if they fire it, right? The gun being pointed at them, saying, listen, every one of your shipments can be stopped at the port as soon as I want it. This is in addition to the fact the FSB also controls cooperation between Russian scientific institutions and foreign institutions, and the vague wording of this decree creates conditions for what they think could authorize a huge degree of repression within Russian academia. Again, also troubling given that the FSB is building a network of prisons and detention centers directly under FSB control rather than the Russian Department of Corrections. It's expected that the individuals housed there are going to be largely dissidents. And there's going to be more dissidents because, you see, one of the core messages that Vladimir Putin has been putting out since the start of this conflict has been Russian ethno-nationalism. This is this concept that the Russian people are intrinsically special, that it is intrinsically right that the Russians are the dominant power in what Putin calls Eurasia. This means that Kazakhs, Tajiks, but especially in this case, Ukrainians, are subordinate races of people, and that Russians are the superior race. That is core to Vladimir Putin's worldview. In fact, And when you look at Wikipedia, you can see that Russia's official state sort of ideology, Eurasianism, is actually tagged as a type of fascist worldview. And let's see if we can find it here. Yeah, the Greater Russia theory, described as a political aspiration of a pan-Russian nationalist and irredentist to retake territories of other republics of the former Soviet Union, right? And let's see, it's also known as Duginism, which again is largely considered to be part of a sort of quasi a neo-fascist ideology. The fact is that this whole ideology is central to mobilizing Putin's conservative base. There's a problem, though. What happens when you kill off 1 million native ethnic Russians, as has happened in this conflict? Well, the answer is the state needs to find workers, taxpayers from somewhere to support Russia's aging population. So the plan is for Russia to import 1 million Indian workers. Yeah, that's right. How is this going to play with Russian ethno-nationalists? Not great, guys. Not great. Russia's domestic labor pool, of course, doesn't have the human beings at any wage point to continue to sustain their civilian economy. And so Russia's plan in 2026 is to draw in large numbers of Indian workers. Right? Russian veterans associations are, of course, up in arms as they say, listen, you told us Russians were special. We Russians signed up to fight for our country, and now you're going to hand our jobs and the Russian economy over to Indian workers, right? They say maybe you should have just not sent us to fight, and we could have just worked to make Russia richer instead of having to die in Ukraine. An interesting thought that perhaps might go somewhere. But again, I think the real takeaway here is that Russian society, Russian civil society is increasingly getting exasperated by this sort of untenable environment, right? And I think this is all just going to be more and more a sign that Putin understands that in order to solve his problems, in order to keep his war machine running, he has to take increasingly unpopular measures. And so again, he was originally using carrots and sticks to keep the Russian public in line. The carrots of rising wages, the carrots of large government contracts, the carrots of relative economic stability as he increasingly draws consumer goods from places like China. But then he also has the sticks of laws, for example, forbidding the criticism of the war and the military, and a strong willingness to use it. He also has the sticks of pushing oligarchs out of windows and media censorship, right? Preventing the true numbers and the true casualties and the true state of the war from ever making it to the Russian public. So, but increasingly, the stick is getting bigger as his carrots, as he has fewer and fewer carrots, just like the Russian public can afford fewer and fewer carrots. Vladimir Putin also has fewer and fewer rewards so he can afford his people. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to James J21, Yanko Georgiev, Chris Gorsuch, Paul Templeton, Cytronic, Steve Moran, TR Need, Alan Leston, CM Holmes, all of our Lieutenant tier members. I could not do this without you guys. You guys are the ones who sustain this whole operation. Thank you so much. I hope you enjoyed today's videos, and I will see you in the next one. Cheers.